Dale Pritchard is 51 years old now. He runs 340 acres in Perry County, Tennessee, and if you ask him how he got the bottom orchard, he will tell you the short version, which is that he paid $15 for it in the fall of 2011, and people thought that was funny. And then they stopped thinking it was funny. And that is more or less all there is to it. If you know Dale Pritchard well enough to press him, he will tell you the longer version. The longer version involves a creek that went wrong, a drainage problem that had been misread for 40 years, and 11 Rouen ducks that stopped making noise on a Thursday morning in late June and would not say why. That Thursday morning was 4 months after the purchase. Dale was 43 at the time. He had been farming Perry County his whole adult life. Corn, some hay, a small cow-calf operation, with 22 Angus and 3 Hereford crossbreeds. And he was not a man given to unusual decisions. The people who knew him then described him in nearly identical terms when you asked. Careful, patient, not flashy. The kind of man who would study a fence line for 10 minutes before he decided where to put the first post. He read the land the way some people read weather, not by looking at the sky, but by reading everything below it. The way the grass lay, the way the soil crusted or didn't after rain, the way water moved or didn't move in the low corners of a field. He had read the Luttrell bottom that way and come to a different conclusion than every other man in the county. That was where the trouble started, if trouble is the right word for it, which it probably isn't. There's something about a person who doesn't have to prove anything. If you know what I mean, you'll know why this story is worth your time. Hit subscribe and stay with us. The Luttrell property, bottom land along Lick Creek in the eastern edge of Perry County, 11 acres of old orchard plus a narrow strip of hardwood running to the water, had belonged to the Luttrell family since the 1940s. Roy Luttrell had planted the orchard in 1952, mostly Stayman winesap with a row of Grimes Golden along the upper edge, varieties his father had favored. The orchard had produced through the 1960s and into the 1970s. And then Roy had gotten old and the spraying had become irregular, and the grass had grown up between the rows and the production had dropped. And by the time Roy died in 2008, the orchard had not been commercially worked in 15 years. His grandson, a man named Brett Luttrell, who lived in Nashville and worked in logistics, inherited it and tried to sell it twice and could not, because Lick Creek had flooded badly in 2010. The worst flood in that part of Perry County since 1973, and the bottom 6 acres of orchard had been under 2 feet of water for 11 days. When the water went down, it left silt on the bark and silt on the ground, and a smell in the low end that Brett Luttrell said, when he described it later, was like nothing he wanted to drive 2 hours to smell again. He listed it for $28,000 in the spring of 2011. He got no offers. He dropped it to $18,500 in August. He got one inquiry, which went nowhere when the inquiring party walked the low end and came back smelling of that silt, and declined. By October, he had decided he would take whatever someone would give him and be done with it, because the property taxes were $1,140 a year, and the orchard was producing nothing. Dale Pritchard had been watching the listing since spring, not closely. The way you watch something from the corner of your eye when you're not ready to decide yet. He had driven the county road along the east fence line of the Luttrell bottom 6 times between March and September, usually on a Saturday morning, usually slow enough that the woman who lived in the farmhouse at the top of the ridge, a widow named Eunice Tanner, who had grown up in Perry County and remembered when the Luttrell orchard was in production, noticed and mentioned it to her nephew at church, who mentioned it to a man named Walt Graber at the coffee counter at Brookside Farm Supply in Linden on a Monday morning in October. Walt farmed 200 acres of row crops north of town and had opinions about most things. And his opinion of the Luttrell bottom was that It was done, and anyone who spent time thinking about it was wasting time that could be spent thinking about something else. He said as much. The men at the counter agreed with him, which is what men at a counter mostly do. 3 days later, Dale Pritchard made an offer of $15. He told Brett Luttrell on the phone that he understood if it was insulting. Brett Luttrell said he had been insulted worse and accepted it the same afternoon. What Dale had been doing on those 6 Saturday morning drives was not scenic touring. He had a legal pad on the seat beside him. Yellow, college ruled, and on it were notes from each pass. Creek line position, the angle of the berm along the south end of the property, the color of the standing water that was still pooling in the low corner in June, which was notable because June is dry in Perry County most years, meaning the water that was still sitting there in June was not from surface runoff, but from somewhere below. He had notes about which trees he could see from the road that showed what he called hanger growth, the stubborn lateral branching that a winesap tree puts out when it is stressed but not dead, trying to catch light from any angle it can reach. He had noted the position of the sun relative to the ridge above the property at mid-morning, because the ridge threw shade on the low end until nearly 10 o'clock, and that shade affected how the ground dried. He had also noted, twice, that a great blue heron was using the flooded low corner as a fishing spot, standing in water that should not have been there, which told him the low corner had not drained properly, and that the reason was structural, not just a matter of waiting for it to go. He had grown up watching his father work troubled land in Lewis County, 20 miles west, and his father had taught him one thing above all others, which was that water sitting where it should not be sitting is a problem you can either fix or you can walk away from. And the people who walk away are almost always walking away from something worth fixing. His father's name was Gareth Pritchard, and Gareth had died of a stroke in 2006 at the age of 77. And Dale had kept, in the chest of drawers in the spare bedroom of his farmhouse, a manila folder containing the notes Gareth had written over the years about the land he had farmed. Some of those notes were about drainage. Gareth had had strong opinions about drainage and had been willing to do the work to correct it when other men would not. Dale had not inherited his father's precise handwriting. He had inherited the rest. His analysis of the Luttrell bottom was not complicated, though it took him 6 months to be confident in it. The flood of 2010 had not killed the orchard. He was fairly certain of that by July of 2011. The bark discoloration on the lower trunks was the waterline stain, not rot, and the scaling he could see on 3 of the visible trees from the road was the outer bark responding to the prolonged wet, not the inner wood failing. The trees were dormant in the way that a plant under stress goes dormant, pulling back to its core. Not the way a dead tree appears dormant, because everything in it has stopped. More important was the drainage problem, which he had identified from the road and confirmed on a single walk-through he did on a Sunday afternoon in September. The one time he had actually entered the property before the purchase. He had gone in through a gap in the east fence and walked the low end for 40 minutes with his boots and his legal pad, and what he found at the south end of the property was a clay berm, an old farm road, built up sometime in the 1960s or earlier to allow equipment to cross the low ground, that was acting as a dam. The berm ran east to west across the natural drainage path, and every time Lick Creek ran high, the water that came into the bottom could not leave because the berm was holding it. It had been holding it for decades, long enough that nobody remembered it as a drainage problem. They had just come to think of the low end of the Luttrell orchard as wet ground, because it had always been wet ground in their lifetimes, and so it was assumed to be naturally wet ground. And naturally wet ground is a different category of problem than a blocked drainage path that can be opened. He estimated the fix at one afternoon with a Caterpillar D4 or equivalent, maybe two. He knew a man who had one. On a Wednesday morning in early November, 11 days after the sale closed, Dale Pritchard drove to the Luttrell Bottom with a man named Clifford Sess, who ran a small equipment operation out of Decaturville and owned a Case 580 backhoe that he rented by the day for $290. Clifford was not told why they were going to a flooded orchard. He was told where to dig and how wide and how deep. And he is the kind of man who does what he is told when he is being paid to do it. And that is most of what needs to be said about Clifford. They cut through the berm in two places. The first cut was at the low point of the berm's east end, where the natural grade ran toward a drainage easement along the fence line. The second cut was 20 feet west of the first, slightly deeper, to ensure the water had two paths out and would not back up if one silted over. Dale had sketched both cuts on the legal pad 2 weeks before. He watched Clifford work and made no adjustments to either cut. The water in the low end began to move within the hour. Not fast, not dramatically, just a slow pull toward the east. The kind of movement you could see in the direction the silt particles drifted when you dropped a handful of dry soil into the water near the berm. By late afternoon, the low corner had dropped 4 inches. By the following Monday, it had drained to the point that Dale could walk the entire low end without his boots going in past the ankle. He had bought a small flock of rowan ducks, 11 birds, purchased from a farm in Hickman County for $6 a bird, $66 total, and he put them on the property the following June, when the ground had dried enough to support them, without their feet sinking at every step. Rowans are calmer than khaki Campbells, quieter as a baseline, which made it more noticeable when they were particularly calm versus when they were vocal. They ranged through the orchard rows, eating slugs and beetle larvae and the kinds of soft-bodied insects that move into wet ground after a flood and stay longer than they are wanted. They were steady birds. They kept up a reasonable amount of duck commentary as they worked. Dale had learned to read their behavior the way you learn to read any animal you keep long enough, not by thinking about it consciously, but by accumulating a sense of their normal and noticing when normal changed. On a Thursday morning in the last week of June, he came to check them at 7 in the morning, and they were silent. All 11. Standing in a loose group near the base of 3 of the old winesap trees in the second row from the south fence, looking at the ground the way ducks look at something they are uncertain about. Not alarmed, not agitated. Still, in the particular way that a duck is still when it has decided the situation requires waiting rather than acting. He stood at the end of the row and watched them for a few minutes. He did not know what they had found. He told his neighbor, a man named Purvis Dade, who farmed 60 acres of hay ground directly north of the Luttrell Bottom, about it that evening when Purvis stopped to talk about a fence line they shared. Purvis said it sounded like they'd found a snake. Dale said maybe, but he didn't think so. He said they weren't frightened, just attentive, and there was a difference. Purvis Dade remembered that conversation later, when the story had gotten around to the point where people were reconstructing it. He said Dale had used the word attentive, which struck him as an unusual word for a duck, and he said he had been skeptical at the time, and then less skeptical after he saw what came out of the soil test. The soil test came back from the Extension Office in September of 2012. Dale had pulled cores from 3 locations: the upland near the Grimes Golden Row, the midsection, and the low area where the ducks had gone quiet. The numbers from the low area were not what the extension agent had expected. The phosphorus and potassium readings were the highest of the 3, which was the reverse of what you would predict. Low ground after a flood tends to be leached out, not enriched. The extension agent, a careful man named Holt Venable, who had been with the university for 14 years, called Dale and asked if he was sure about the sampling location. Dale said he was sure. Holt Venable wrote in his notes that the alluvial deposition in the low area had produced a soil profile that was, in his word, unusual for that part of Perry County. He had not seen phosphorus numbers that high in bottomland that had been under flood conditions in the previous 2 years. He thought the creek must have been carrying sediment from a particularly rich source upstream, possibly from cultivated fields on the ridge above the watershed, and that the prolonged ponding had allowed that sediment to settle and consolidate in a way that surface drainage would not have permitted. He said this was not unprecedented, but it was not common either. Dale did not say anything about the ducks to Holt Venable. The trees in the low end came back over the winter of 2012 and into the spring of 2013. Not all of them. 3 of the 12 wine saps in the low 2 rows did not come back, and Dale cut them out in March and used the wood for kindling, and did not grieve them particularly. 9 came back. By the fall of 2013, 7 of the 9 were bearing enough fruit to be worth picking. Small yields. The wine saps running smaller than they should have been, but with the concentrated flavor that an old variety apple develops when it has been stressed and is fighting back. He picked 440 pounds that year and sold it at $0.95 a pound at the farm market in Linden on 3 consecutive Saturdays and once at a tailgate market in Hohenwald. That came to $418 roughly, though he lost track of the exact figure by December. By 2015, with the drainage holding and the soil recovering and the duck flock rotating through the rows twice a week, the orchard had 14 producing trees. He had added 6 Fuji trees on the upper end near the Grimes Golden Row, planted in the spring of 2014, and they were showing their first real fruit in the fall of 2015. He worked out an arrangement with a regional grocery buying program out of Columbia that was sourcing local heirloom varieties, and the wine saps went for $2. 10 a pound through that arrangement. That fall he brought in 1,840 pounds between the old trees and the new, which came out to just under $3,400 after the market fee. 11 acres. $15. Walt Graber, who had offered his opinion at the Brookside Farm Supply counter in October of 2011 about the Luttrell Bottom being done, drove past it on a Saturday morning in the fall of 2016 and stopped on the shoulder of the road for a few minutes and looked at it. He told his wife that evening that it looked like a real orchard. His wife said it had always been a real orchard. He said that was not what he meant. He stopped by Dale's place the following spring and asked about the drainage. Dale showed him the cut in the berm and explained the clay layer and the blocked path and the 40-year misread of the problem. Walt listened and nodded. He asked about the soil. Dale showed him the extension report. Walt said the numbers were surprising. Dale said they were. Walt asked how he had known before he bought it. Dale was quiet for a moment, looking at the legal pad on the kitchen table, which by then was thick with notes from the Luttrell Bottom and starting to fall apart at the binding. He said his father had a saying, which was that wet ground talks if you listen to it long enough. He said he had spent 6 months listening to the Luttrell Bottom before he made an offer, and that by the time he made it, he was fairly sure he understood what it was saying. Walt asked about the ducks. Dale said the ducks were separate. Dale Pritchard is 51 years old now. He still has the Rons, a different generation, the original 11 long gone the way of working animals. And he still walks the low end on most Saturday mornings. The wine saps are producing 3,200 pounds a year on a good year. He has not sold the property and does not intend to. He has added 2 rows of Arkansas Black on the east side where the Grimes Golden failed, because Arkansas Blacks are late-season keepers and the buyers in his arrangement have asked for them. He still has the legal pad. He has added 37 pages of notes to it since the purchase, most of them about the behavior of the soil in the low end after different amounts of rain at different times of year. because the low end keeps doing things he finds interesting. He thinks the creek is still depositing upstream sediment and that the soil profile in the lowest quarter acre is still changing. He thinks it will be 10 more years before he fully understands it. He said this to Eunice Tanner once, the widow from the Ridge farmhouse, who had noticed him driving past in 2011. She is 83 now and walks with a cane and still has opinions. She said Roy Luttrell had said something similar in his last years, that the bottom never quite finished, surprising him, and that this had been what he liked about it. Dale did not know that Roy Luttrell had said that. He thought about it for a few days after she told him. He said later to Purvis Dade that he thought the bottom had surprised Roy Luttrell and Roy Luttrell hadn't quite known how to talk to it. He said that was the only thing that had gone wrong with the Luttrell orchard. Not the flood, not the years of neglect. Just a piece of ground that had something to say, and a long gap between the man who had last known how to listen and the one who came next. The ducks knew first. That much seems clear. What they knew exactly, and why 11 Rorans standing still on a Thursday morning in June is the kind of thing a person should pay attention to, Dale Pritchard cannot fully explain. He paid attention. The rest of it follows from that.